The marriage certificate still survives in the Louisiana State Archives, faded yellow and fragile with age, showing the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, with her listed plainly as property beneath his name. What makes this record so unsettling is not only the horrific nature of the union between a plantation owner and the enslaved woman who cooked his meals, but also the 13 unexplained deaths that followed in the months after their wedding in March of 1854. Local newspapers from that time, carefully kept in private collections, quietly suggest a conspiracy so complex and brutal that officials chose to bury the investigation in order to shield some of Louisiana's most powerful families. The truth behind this forced marriage exposes a tangled story of betrayal, revenge, and organized cruelty that shocked even the violence-hardened antebellum South. Before we go deeper into the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the nightmare that waited for him at Willowbrook Plantation, be sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which state you are listening from. Now, let me take you back to an era when honor was everything, and when broken trust could ruin a man in ways far worse than death. The events that led to that cursed marriage began 15 years earlier in the dark backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were built on human suffering and blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich was not born into the plantation elite that shaped Louisiana society in the 1840s. He was the son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky, and he arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with nothing except burning ambition and a readiness to enter lines of business that more respectable men avoided. The slave trade, though legal, carried a social stain among old Creole families who preferred to pretend their wealth came only from sugar and cotton, not from buying and selling human lives. During the oppressive summer of 1840, Aldrich formed a partnership with Marcus Deveau and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose desperation matched his own cold ambition. Deveau, the youngest son of a fading sugar baron, needed cash to save his family's collapsing plantation from creditors. Rochelle, a former ship captain ruined by yellow fever and failed investments, held priceless knowledge of illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean. Together, they created what they called the Delta Trading Company, operating out of a warehouse on the edge of New Orleans, where laws were loosely enforced and questions were rarely asked. The business became far more profitable than any of them expected. Unlike legitimate traders who dealt in documented property with proper papers and health records, Aldrich's operation focused on what they politely called recovery services. They bought enslaved people who had fled failed plantations, purchased kidnapped free black people from corrupt bounty hunters, and, most profitably, smuggled new captives from illegal ships that still crossed the Atlantic despite the official ban. Their profits were enormous because they spent almost nothing on care, housing, or basic human needs. For 3 years the partnership thrived in the shadows of New Orleans society. They washed their money through respectable businesses, purchasing both land and social standing. Deveau rescued his family plantation and expanded it into one of the most productive sugar estates in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle bought riverboats and became known as a respected shipping businessman. Aldrich himself purchased Willowbrook Plantation, a modest but steady cotton operation about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with a grand mansion that announced his arrival among Louisiana's planter class. But success led to carelessness, and carelessness drew dangerous attention. In the spring of 1843, rumors reached them that federal marshals were looking into illegal slave trading along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking hard questions, checking shipping records, and even speaking to former captives who had escaped or gained freedom. The three partners met in a tense emergency meeting in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook, surrounded by leather-bound books he could not read and portraits of ancestors who were not his. The air in the room felt heavy as each man understood that their empire was close to collapse. Deveau, always the most anxious, urged them to dissolve the partnership and burn every record. Rochelle, guided by a sailor's logic, suggested quietly moving assets offshore and waiting out the investigation. Aldrich, however, had already chosen a darker path. He decided to kill his partners and take everything they owned. He needed a plan that would remove suspicion from himself, while silencing the only men who could destroy him. With chilling clarity, he settled on murder. He would kill them both and stage the scene to make it appear they had killed each other during a fight over money. As the lone survivor of a tragic dispute, he could erase the evidence and keep their wealth. The murders happened on a hot June evening in 1843 at the warehouse that had served as their base for 3 years. Aldrich arranged the meeting under the excuse of planning their escape from the business. The area was deserted after dark, and the warehouse was scheduled for demolition the next month. Aldrich arrived early with a loaded pistol hidden in his coat and a sharp skinning knife in his boot. His plan was simple: shoot Devo first, then kill Rochelle with the knife, claiming self-defense. He had even hired 3 dock workers to act as false witnesses, men who would say they saw Devo and Rochelle arguing violently earlier that day over missing money. When his partners arrived, they found Aldrich already seated at their usual table, a bottle of fine whiskey and 3 glasses set among stacks of ledgers and shipping papers. The meeting began calmly. Devo reviewed their legal danger, and Rochelle explained a plan to move funds to Havana banks beyond American law. As the night went on and the whiskey disappeared, Aldrich shifted the talk toward their hidden cash and personal account details. Rochelle was the first to sense danger. Years at sea had sharpened his instincts, and he noticed Aldrich's strange behavior, his eyes avoiding contact, his hand drifting toward his coat, the tension in his voice. When Rochelle suggested delaying the meeting until lawyers could be present, Aldrich knew his chance was slipping away. Violence exploded without warning. Aldrich pulled his pistol and shot Devo in the chest. The gunshot thundered through the empty warehouse as Devo fell back, blood spreading across his shirt. Rochelle reacted faster than Aldrich expected. He flipped the heavy table and attacked with a broken bottle, cutting Aldrich's face and leaving a scar that would never fade. A brutal struggle followed, lasting nearly 10 minutes. They smashed crates, scattered papers, and smeared blood everywhere as they fought over the knife. In the end, Rochelle's age failed him. Aldrich drove the blade into his stomach, twisting it upward. As he died, Rochelle whispered words that would follow Aldrich forever, warning that his son knew everything and would one day come for him. Aldrich ignored the threat, unaware that both Devo's brother and Rochelle's son held detailed records of every crime the Delta Trading Company had committed. He even added extra cuts and injuries on his own hands and arms to strengthen his story that he was an innocent bystander trapped in their violent clash. The fake witnesses acted exactly as they had been paid to, telling police they had seen Devo and Rochelle arguing earlier that night over missing partnership money. One corrupt dock worker claimed he had heard loud shouting coming from the warehouse around the time of the killings, followed by gunshots and the sounds of a fierce struggle. Most importantly, Aldrich had already prepared a believable reason for why he was at the scene. He stated that he had come to calm things down between his partners, only to walk into a deadly fight that forced him to struggle for his own survival. The New Orleans police, overloaded with more serious crimes and eager to close a case involving 3 seemingly respectable businessmen, accepted Aldrich's story with very little investigation. The official report declared that Devo and Rochelle had killed each other during a business dispute, with Aldrich narrowly escaping the same end. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as scheduled, wiping out any remaining physical evidence of the partnership's illegal dealings. With both partners dead and their assets suddenly free to claim, Aldrich moved fast to secure his new wealth. He presented himself as the lone surviving partner of a legitimate shipping company, showing carefully forged documents that stated Devo and Rochelle had agreed to transfer their shares to him if they died. Banks that had once been wary of 3 unknown men moving large amounts of cash were quick to trust a single plantation owner with a recorded history of successful cotton production. Over the next several months, Aldrich methodically emptied every account, safe deposit box, and hidden stash of cash that had belonged to his murdered partners. He estimated the total value at nearly $40,000, a massive fortune that would equal well over $1 million today. Even more important, he had removed the only 2 people who could tie him to the Delta Trading Company's illegal activities, allowing him to remake himself as a respectable figure in Louisiana society. However, Aldrich made a deadly mistake. While obsessing over immediate dangers and financial gain, he completely ignored the families of the men he had killed. He failed to realize that both Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had younger relatives who would soon uncover the truth about their deaths, and who would spend the next 10 years slowly, carefully, and patiently planning a revenge so detailed and ruthless that death would seem merciful compared to what awaited him. Philip Devo was only 22 years old when his brother Marcus was murdered. Unlike the older Devo men who favored quick rewards over long-term planning, Philip had a sharp, calculating mind that made him far more dangerous than Aldrich ever suspected. As Marcus's closest confidant and unofficial business manager, Philip had kept detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction. These included coded ledgers listing illegal slave purchases, shipping records from banned Caribbean routes, and most damaging of all, letters exchanged with corrupt officials who had helped protect their operation. More importantly, Philip had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Something about the Kentucky newcomer's eagerness to take part in the most brutal sides of their business felt excessive to him, even by the standards of men who traded in human lives. Months before the murders, Philip had begun looking into Aldrich's past and uncovered contradictions in his personal story and strange financial patterns that suggested motives far deeper than simple greed. When news of Marcus's death reached Philip at the family's struggling plantation, his first response was not sorrow, but a cold and controlled rage. The official explanation made no sense to anyone who truly knew the three partners. Marcus, though desperate for money, was naturally careful and would never have confronted Samuel Rochelle violently. Rochelle, despite his rough sailor background, was a disciplined businessman who preferred negotiation over physical fights. Most revealing of all, Aldrich's version of the night included details that Philip knew were untrue, including references to money and accounts that had already been moved weeks earlier. Within days of the funeral, Philip began his own investigation into the warehouse killings. Using contacts from his brother's business circles, he spoke with dock workers, reviewed shipping logs, and even bribed police officers to examine the official evidence. What he uncovered confirmed his darkest fears. The crime scene had been carefully arranged. Witnesses had been paid to lie, and key pieces of evidence had been intentionally ignored or destroyed. Most telling was the fact that Aldrich had started accessing his dead partner's financial assets within hours of their deaths, showing clear preparation that directly contradicted his claim of being an innocent bystander. At the same time, Henry Rochelle was conducting his own inquiry from a very different direction. At 24, Samuel's son had inherited his father's maritime connections, but also possessed formal training in law and business that made him especially suited to track financial crimes. Henry had spent years working in New Orleans banks and shipping firms, building relationships with clerks, managers, and officials who could supply information that Philip's more direct methods might overlook. Henry's investigation revealed the true scale of Aldrich's theft. By carefully studying bank records, shipping documents, and property transfers, he traced how the killer had systematically stripped every asset from the Delta Trading Company. Henry estimated that Aldrich had stolen more than $60,000 in cash, property, and investments, wealth built over years of illegal but profitable operations rooted in the suffering of hundreds of enslaved people. What made Henry especially dangerous was his deep understanding of how Louisiana's legal and financial systems actually functioned. While Philip focused on proving Aldrich's guilt through direct evidence, Henry realized that the better strategy was to turn Aldrich's greed against him. Rather than seeking justice through a corrupt court system, Henry began designing a plan to slowly destroy Aldrich's financial base, leaving him exposed to the same betrayal and violence he had once used on others. The two young men met for the first time in the fall of 1844, more than a year after their relatives were murdered. They met at a quiet restaurant in the French Quarter, where Philip intended to share his evidence with Henry and coordinate their separate investigations. Neither man expected how perfectly their different skills would fit together, or how completely their shared hunger for justice would consume the next decade of their lives. By the spring of 1845, Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle had turned their personal searches for truth into something far more calculated and dangerous. They created a carefully organized conspiracy designed to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich using the very tools he had relied on to kill their family members: betrayal, financial manipulation, and eventually violence hidden behind legitimate business dealings. Unlike Aldrich's reckless cruelty, their strategy would be slow, precise, and utterly devastating in its completeness. The first stage of their plan focused on entering Aldrich's social and business circles. Philip, using what remained of his family's connections in Louisiana society, began attending the same gentlemen's clubs, political meetings, and social events where Aldrich was building his image as a respectable planter. His purpose was not confrontation but observation. He studied Aldrich's routines, habits, weaknesses, and especially his financial pressures. With his late brother's charm and social ease, Philip soon became one of Aldrich's casual companions, close enough to drink and gamble with, but not important enough to raise suspicion. Meanwhile, Henry used his banking contacts to track every corner of Aldrich's growing empire. He discovered that the planter's apparent success rested on unstable ground, risky investments, heavy loans, and business deals that produced quick profits while creating serious long-term debt. Most critical of all, Henry uncovered Aldrich's growing gambling addiction. Aldrich regularly lost huge sums in high-stakes poker games and horse races, covering his losses by borrowing more and more against the future harvests of his plantation. This gambling weakness gave them the opening they needed. By 1848, Henry had secured a position at the First National Bank of New Orleans, the same bank that held the main mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From there, he subtly adjusted Aldrich's credit terms, ensuring loan renewals came with slightly higher interest, repayment schedules that caused cash shortages during planting seasons, and steady pressure that pushed Aldrich closer to desperation. At the same time, Philip built relationships with several of New Orleans' most notorious gambling operators, men who ran elite games where fortunes could vanish overnight. Through careful bribes and promises of future favors, Philip arranged for Aldrich to receive invitations to increasingly expensive games, where the stakes were higher and the other players were secretly working together against him, to make sure the plantation owner would lose much more than he could ever afford. What made their method so effective was the slow pace and quiet control behind it. Instead of facing Aldrich openly or rushing into violent revenge, they focused on breaking the financial base that held up his status and sense of pride. Each loan that reached its deadline added new pressure. Every loss at the gambling table increased his panic, and every failed effort to get fast money through dangerous investments pushed him closer to total collapse. They wanted him reduced to a state where he could no longer protect himself and would be exposed to whatever final punishment they decided to give him. By the year 1851, clear signs of damage were visible. Aldrich's debts had risen to almost $30,000, and just paying interest was eating up most of what his plantation earned each year. He had already sold off several pieces of his land to cover gambling losses, and whispers were spreading among wealthy planters in Louisiana that Willowbrook Plantation was close to financial disaster. Even more telling was the change in Aldrich himself. The constant money problems were wearing him down. He had grown irritable, distrustful of everyone around him, and increasingly reckless as he searched for new ways to make money. Still, Philip and Dry were not satisfied with ruining him financially. They wanted something deeper and far more personal. Their true aim was to make Aldrich feel the same fear and humiliation that their murdered family members had felt in their final moments. They wanted him to realize that his success was built on blood, that his respected image was a lie, and that justice had finally caught up with him despite his careful planning and cruelty. The last stage of their revenge required pushing him past simple desperation into a place where he had no real choices left. They needed him trapped so completely that death would seem like an escape compared to what they offered. At the same time, they wanted him alive long enough to fully understand how carefully and intelligently their revenge had been designed. It was Henry who suggested using Aldrich's own enslaved people as the key to his downfall. Every plantation owner lived with a deep fear of rebellion, and that fear could be used by men who understood how masters thought. But instead of encouraging an actual uprising, which would be dangerous and morally wrong, Henry proposed a quieter and more cruel idea. They would force Aldrich into marriage with one of his own enslaved people. This act would publicly shame him, destroy his reputation, and leave him legally unable to undo what had been done to him. Choosing Celeste for this role was no accident. Philip and Henry spent many months observing everyone who lived and worked at Willowbrook Plantation. They searched for someone whose forced marriage to Aldrich would cause the greatest social damage and also allow them control over his final fate. Celeste was the perfect choice for reasons far beyond her looks or position. At 38 years old, she was a large woman, but her size meant very little to them. What truly mattered was her sharp mind, her strong will to survive, and above all her deep hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many enslaved people who learned to hide their feelings to stay safe, Celeste never bothered to disguise her contempt. She did her job as head cook well and without protest. But anyone paying close attention could see the quiet rage in her eyes whenever Aldrich was near. Her hatred came from painful experiences. Aldrich had bought Celeste in 1847 from a failing plantation in Mississippi. During that sale, she was torn away from her husband and 3 children, who were sold to different owners in different states. There had been no financial need to separate them. Aldrich could easily have bought the whole family, but he chose not to. He wanted a skilled cook and saw no value in what he called extra mouths to feed. When Celeste begged him to at least buy her youngest child, a 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich laughed and told her he was running a plantation, not an orphanage for colored children. For 7 long years, Celeste endured the daily insult of cooking fine meals for the man who destroyed her family. She served him rich food while she lived on scraps and leftovers. She listened as he entertained guests with stories of his success, knowing his wealth came from stolen money and murdered partners. She washed blood from his clothes after strange nighttime trips and watched him burn papers and letters in the kitchen fireplace as he tried to hide proof of his growing financial trouble. Over time, she also learned everything about his daily life. She knew his routines, his habits, his illnesses, and his increasing fear of creditors and enemies. She knew what food he liked, what medicine he took for his stomach pain, and which rooms he used most often. This knowledge made her a dangerous enemy and a valuable ally for anyone who wanted to control or destroy him. Reaching out to Celeste had to be done carefully. Philip and Henry could not risk speaking to an enslaved person on Aldrich's land, since that would raise suspicion and bring legal trouble. Instead, they worked through free people of color who sold goods in New Orleans markets and had honest reasons to visit rural plantations. Using these messengers, they slowly built contact with Celeste, first offering small sums of money in exchange for information about Aldrich's habits. What they learned surprised them. Celeste had already been quietly working against her owner for years. She often oversalted his meals to worsen his stomach pain, broke his favorite items by accident, and spread rumors among the enslaved workers about his debts and possible plans to sell them. Everything she did was subtle and easy to deny, meant to increase his stress without exposing her. When Philip and Henry finally told her who they were and explained their plan, Celeste did not hesitate. She agreed to help them destroy Aldrich completely. Her only demand was freedom and safe travel to Canada, where she hoped one day to find any children who might still be alive. Philip and Henry accepted at once. They knew they had gained not just a tool, but a partner whose desire for justice matched their own. Over the next several months they worked out every detail. Aldrich would be driven into total ruin through planned gambling losses and loans called in at the worst moments. Then he would face a terrible choice. He would either marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or die at the hands of his creditors. The marriage would end his social standing and give Philip and Henry legal access to his property through control of his wife. Most importantly, it would put Celeste in a position to slowly poison him, letting him suffer the same long and painful death that their loved ones had endured. One final detail mattered most: the timing. Aldrich had to fall when he was alone and unable to ask for help from powerful friends or the law. That moment came in early 1854. Henry learned that Aldrich planned to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, hoping to win enough money to save his plantation from foreclosure. It was the perfect chance. Desperate and isolated, Aldrich would agree to anything that promised survival. The gambling house where Jeremiah Aldrich would meet his end was inside an old warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront. It was a place where desperate and dangerous men gathered to risk everything on cards and dice. On a humid night in February 1854, fog rolled in from the Mississippi River, covering the streets in thick gray mist and giving the city an unreal, dreamlike feel. Aldrich arrived carrying a leather bag holding $8,000, almost every bit of cash he could raise by selling enslaved people tools and personal belongings from Willowbrook Plantation. This money was his final hope to escape ruin. What he did not know was that Philip Deveau and Henry Rochelle had planned every part of this night. Every other man at the table had been chosen to work together to take everything he had left. The game was 5-card stud poker. The game was played with stakes that began at $500 a hand and climbed fast as the night went on. Aldrich had some early luck, winning enough smaller pots to convince himself that his fortune might finally be turning in his favor. As the bets grew larger and the drinks kept coming, his judgment started to fail. He placed bolder and riskier wagers, pushed by panic and a false sense of confidence born from those early wins. By the time midnight arrived, Aldrich had already lost more than half of his money, yet he stayed at the table, playing with the fierce desperation of a man who knew this was truly his final chance to avoid total collapse. The other men at the table, acting on Philip's quiet guidance, let him win just often enough to keep hope alive. Slowly they tightened the pressure, steering him into betting sums that equaled everything he still owned on single draws of cards. The last hand began shortly after 2 in the morning. Outside, thick fog wrapped the streets so completely that the gas lamps barely cast light through the warehouse windows. Aldrich was dealt what looked like a powerful hand, a visible pair of kings with the chance of becoming a full house if the hidden cards aligned. Certain that this was the moment he could win back his losses and maybe secure his future for good, he shoved his final $3,000 into the center of the table. What he did not know was that the others held even stronger hands. Worse still, they had been quietly working together to make sure the final pot would be large enough to wipe Aldrich out completely and leave him buried under debts he could never hope to repay. When the cards were turned over, his pair of kings was defeated by a full house held by a man he had never seen before. The stranger's eyes were cold and unreadable as he gathered the winnings with calm precision, like someone who had known all along how this would end. As the truth of his total financial ruin settled in, Aldrich remained seated unmoving, staring at the felt table where his last chance had vanished. The other players were already gone, but the stranger stayed behind, watching Aldrich closely, as if studying a curious subject. Several heavy minutes passed before the man finally spoke. His voice carried a faint French accent that sounded familiar, though Aldrich could not immediately place it. He said, "Mr. Aldrich, I believe it is time we discussed your unpaid obligations. The men who just left are not simply gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have shown you great patience. But patience, like good luck, does not last forever." At that moment, Philip Deveau stepped out from the shadows near the warehouse door. The flickering gaslight revealed his face clearly, making his likeness to his murdered brother impossible to miss. Aldrich felt his blood run cold as he recognized the features he had seen twisted in pain and disbelief 11 years earlier, when Marcus Deveau died with a bullet in his chest and betrayal in his eyes. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philip said, gliding closer to the table. "Perhaps that's because you have. My name is Philip Deveau, and you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last man to see him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse suddenly felt freezing despite the warm, damp Louisiana night outside. Aldrich's hands trembled as the full truth became clear. This had never been a lucky card game or an opportunity to save his plantation. It was a carefully planned trap, built over years with patience and deep hatred. Henry Rochelle stepped out from another dark corner of the warehouse, completing the circle around Aldrich. "My father Samuel always said you were clever, Aldrich," Henry said. "Clever enough to kill 2 men and steal everything they built, but not clever enough to realize that dead men often leave sons behind. Sons who remember their father's stories and never forget their father's killers." Silence filled the warehouse, broken only by distant ship horns echoing across the fog-covered river. Aldrich sat trapped between them, his thoughts racing for escape but finding none. He was alone, in a forgotten building, facing 2 men who had spent more than a decade preparing his downfall. His financial ruin also meant no one would search for him if he vanished into the Mississippi Delta. Philip pulled out the chair directly across from Aldrich and sat down carefully before speaking again. "We know everything, Jeremiah. We know about the Delta Trading Company and your illegal slave dealings. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers without mercy. We know about the forged papers, the bribed witnesses, and the slow theft of everything they worked for. Most of all, we know you have lived for 11 years on blood money, building a respectable plantation life on their graves." Henry moved closer and placed a leather folder on the table, opening it to reveal stacks of documents spread out like courtroom evidence. "These are copies of every financial move you've made since 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Bank records showing how you drained our father's accounts. Property papers proving how you claimed assets that never belonged to you. Even letters exchanged with corrupt officials who helped hide your crimes. Those officials now care far more about saving themselves than protecting you." The proof was crushing and real. Aldrich saw papers he believed had been destroyed long ago, records that could only come from years of investigation, bribery, and careful planning. Worst of all were sworn statements from witnesses who had seen parts of his crimes but stayed silent until now. Philip and Henry had built a case strong enough to condemn him in any court and expose many powerful Louisiana figures who had unknowingly helped clean his stolen wealth. "The question," Philip went on, "is what we choose to do with this knowledge. We could hand it to federal authorities, who would be eager to prosecute you and everyone who helped you. Or we could allow certain people in New Orleans to discover that you've lived a lie for over a decade, one built on murder. Either path likely ends with your death, probably after a great deal of suffering." Aldrich finally managed to speak, though his voice was barely audible. "What do you want? I can get money. My plantation is Your plantation is worthless," Henry cut in. "We own the mortgage, remember, along with most of your debts. We've been buying your obligations for years. Every loan, every gambling loss, every agreement keeping you afloat belongs to us now. You have nothing left to offer except your life, and we are not especially interested in saving it." The warehouse seemed to grow even colder as their meaning settled in. Aldrich was not just ruined. He was completely under their control. Everything he had built and enjoyed had been stripped away by the sons of the men he killed. Still, some stubborn part of him refused to believe death was unavoidable. "There is one other option," Philip said, his tone almost thoughtful. "One way you might be allowed to keep breathing for a little longer. It would demand a serious sacrifice of pride, a public confession of who you truly are and proof of your total obedience to us." Henry smiled with grim satisfaction. "You are going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah, publicly and legally. You will stand before God and society and take your cook Celeste as your wife. You will live as her husband, share her bed, and present yourself as a man who chose to marry his own property." The idea was so shocking and humiliating that Aldrich could barely understand it. In that society, such a marriage meant legal destruction, social death, and public shame worse than dying. "You're mad," he whispered. "No one would ever allow it. No preacher would agree. No court would accept it. We've already arranged everything," Philip replied calmly. "There is a minister in Natchitoches Parish deeply in debt to certain gambling houses. He will perform a legal ceremony with witnesses and proper papers. As for the courts, Louisiana law is very clear. A marriage, once properly completed, is binding no matter the circumstances. You would be legally married to Celeste, with every right and responsibility that came with it." Henry leaned forward across the table, his eyes shining with cruel satisfaction. The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it offers you a choice. You may reject our generous proposal and face immediate punishment for your crimes. Punishment that would include far more physical suffering than you are likely imagining. Or you may accept short-term shame in exchange for staying alive, no matter how broken and degraded that life may become. The warehouse went quiet once more as Aldrich struggled with the impossible choice before him. Death would be final, but it would at least protect a fragment of his reputation. His neighbors might remember him as a man ruined by gambling and failed ventures, but they would never learn the truth about his murders or the full extent of his crimes. Marriage to Celeste, however, would erase his social standing completely while forcing him to live through years of public disgrace and private misery. "How long?" he finally asked. "If I agree to this arrangement, how long will it last?" Philip and Ori exchanged a look filled with shared meaning and quiet satisfaction. "For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich. Marriage is a sacred bond, and given your age and your obvious health issues, we suspect your natural life may not last as long as you hope." The meaning was cold and unmistakable. This was not a temporary humiliation followed by freedom. It was a slow execution disguised as marriage, a long torture meant to crush his spirit before his body finally gave out. Still, the other option, a swift execution in a fog-filled warehouse with his body dumped into the Mississippi River, felt even worse than whatever future they had prepared for him. Just when we thought the horror could go no further, the nightmare inside this Louisiana warehouse deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Tap the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. After what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes, Aldrich lifted his head and stared directly at his tormentors. "If I agree to this marriage, what assurance do I have that you won't kill me anyway?" "None at all," Henry replied with blunt honesty. "But you do have our word that when your death finally comes, it will be far gentler than what we first planned. Think of the marriage as a chance to prove good behavior. Obedience will earn kindness. Defiance will be answered with imagination." Philip pulled a document from his coat and laid it on the table beside the evidence of Aldrich's crimes. "This is a properly prepared marriage contract, ready for your signature. The ceremony is set for tomorrow evening at Willowbrook Plantation, where your neighbors and business partners will attend to witness your voluntary union with Celeste. They have been told you experienced a religious awakening and wish to show Christian charity by raising one of your slaves to the position of wife. The deepest humiliation was that he must present the marriage as his own decision, a willing act of Christian goodwill rather than the forced degradation it truly was. His neighbors would see him as strange, perhaps unstable, but they would believe he chose this path freely. No one would suspect coercion by the vengeful sons of murdered partners because no one even knew Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had ever existed. Aldrich reached for the marriage contract, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the paper steady. The terms were simple and absolute. He would marry Celeste in a lawful ceremony, live with her as husband and wife, and provide for her as any spouse should. In return, his creditors would delay collecting his debts and allow him to continue operating Willowbrook Plantation under strict supervision. As he signed his name on the document that would ruin his life, Aldrich tried to convince himself that time bought through obedience might offer a way out. Perhaps he could appeal to authorities, escape to another state, or uncover a legal flaw that would void the marriage. But even as these desperate ideas crossed his mind, he saw the satisfaction in Philip and Henry's eyes. They had planned this for more than 10 years and had already anticipated every escape he might attempt. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philip said as he gathered the signed contract. "We'll see you tomorrow evening for the ceremony. I trust you'll dress properly for such an important event." The morning of March 15, 1854 arrived gray and suffocating, heavy clouds threatening rain while damp winds carried the smell of rotting swamp plants. Aldrich had not slept since returning from New Orleans, spending the night pacing his study and staring at the marriage contract that marked the end of everything he had built over 15 years in Louisiana. Celeste had been informed of the arrangement through intermediaries, though she acted surprised when Aldrich awkwardly tried to explain during breakfast. She listened to his rambling story of financial problems and social obligations with the calm patience of a parent hearing a child confess a small mistake. When he finished, she simply nodded and said, "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I will prepare for the ceremony." The calm tone of her voice frightened him more than anger ever could. It suggested preparation and coordination, as if she had known about the plan long before he was forced to accept it. As he watched her move efficiently through the kitchen, preparing what would be their final meal as master and slave, Aldrich began to understand that his tormentor's planning was far more complete than he had realized. Throughout the day, neighbors and acquaintances arrived at Willowbrook Plantation, drawn by invitations sent in Aldrich's name by Philip and Henry. Guests were told they would witness an extraordinary act of Christian charity, as their neighbor had chosen to honor one of his most loyal servants by granting her the dignity and protection of marriage. Many arrived expecting a joke, or proof that Aldrich had finally lost his sanity under financial pressure. Instead, they found a well-arranged wedding, complete with decorations, food, and a nervous groom who appeared genuinely committed to the strange event. Aldrich wore his finest clothing as Philip had advised, and played his role with the desperation of a man who knew his life depended on a convincing performance. When questioned about his decision, he repeated the story of religious renewal and Christian duty with enough sincerity that most accepted it as the odd choice of a man under severe stress. Celeste entered dressed in a simple but tasteful gown provided for the occasion. At 38 she was a large woman, yet she carried herself with dignity and calm that impressed even skeptical guests. More importantly, she appeared truly happy, smiling warmly at the crowd and thanking them for attending what she called the most important day of my life. The minister from Natchitoches Parish conducted the ceremony efficiently, reading the traditional vows and requesting the proper responses from bride and groom. When he reached the moment inviting objections, several guests shifted uneasily, but none dared interrupt what seemed to be a legal and voluntary marriage between two consenting adults. Aldrich's voice barely reached the first row as he spoke his vows, but Celeste's responses were clear and confident. She promised to love, honor, and obey her husband with such conviction that the ceremony almost felt normal, as if marriages like this were not unheard of in Louisiana society. The most unsettling moment came when the minister declared them husband and wife and instructed Aldrich to kiss his bride. His face drained of color as he leaned forward, and for a moment it seemed he might collapse. But Celeste steadied him gently, rising to meet his lips in a brief chaste kiss that sealed their legal bond and marked the final stage of his downfall. As the guests departed, many shaking their heads in confusion, Aldrich was left alone with his new wife in the plantation house that had once symbolized his success. The rooms now felt unfamiliar and threatening, as though the ceremony had turned them into places where he no longer belonged. Celeste moved through the house with the confidence of someone who knew the balance of power had permanently shifted. She began rearranging furniture and personal items with casual authority, reinforcing her position as mistress of the home. When Aldrich tried to object, she fixed him with a stare filled with years of buried resentment and said quietly, "We're married now, Jeremiah, husband and wife, partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" That first night, as they lay in the same as he lay in the bed that had once been his private refuge, Aldrich realized that his enemies had created a punishment far more complex than simple death. They had locked him inside a daily reminder of his weakness, placing him beside someone who knew every detail of his crimes and fully understood what he deserved. Every meal she prepared, every sentence she spoke, every small act that looked like care was actually a careful reminder that his comfortable life had been built on violence and stolen lives. Yet the real terror was still ahead. As Aldrich would soon learn, the marriage was not the final act of Philip and Hungry's revenge. It was only the start of a slow and carefully planned ruin that would make his last moments in the warehouse seem almost kind by comparison. The first month of marriage passed with a false sense of normality as Celeste stepped into her new role with a level of skill that surprised even Aldrich's remaining neighbors. She ran the household staff with firm control, hosted the few visitors who still dared to come to Willowbrook Plantation, and upheld the social appearances that allowed her husband to cling to a small piece of his former respect. To anyone watching from the outside, the strange marriage appeared to function as smoothly as any typical union in rural Louisiana. But Aldrich began to notice small changes in his daily life that filled him with growing dread. His morning coffee developed a faint bitter taste that he could not explain. Although Celeste used the same beans and the same methods she always had, his evening meals, while beautifully prepared and expertly cooked, left him feeling slightly sick and deeply exhausted. Most troubling of all were the headaches and sudden spells of dizziness that grew worse whenever he spent long periods near his wife. At first, he blamed stress and the emotional weight of his humiliation, being forced into marriage and knowing he depended entirely on the mercy of Philip and Henry was enough. He thought to damage anyone's health. But as the weeks passed and his condition slowly declined, Aldrich began to suspect that something more intentional was happening. His fears were confirmed during a visit from Dr. Hamilton Warren, the plantation's longtime physician, who was called after Aldrich collapsed during a meeting with possible cotton buyers. Dr. Warren's initial examination revealed symptoms that matched long-term poisoning, specifically the slow buildup of toxic substances that attack the stomach and nervous system over time. He explained that the signs pointed to arsenic or a similar metal poison administered in small amounts over many months. Such poisoning caused increasing weakness, stomach pain, and damage to the nerves, and without immediate treatment and removal from the source, it always ended in death. This diagnosis confirmed Aldrich's darkest thoughts about his wife's true purpose. Celeste was killing him with the same patience and precision that Philip and Ori had used to destroy his wealth and reputation. She was giving him poison in measured doses, likely hidden in his food or drink, crafting a slow death that would appear natural to anyone not searching for signs of murder. But accusing Celeste directly would be useless and dangerous. As his wife, she was protected by law by her outward innocence, and most of all by her ties to the men who controlled every part of his remaining life. Any accusation would be denied, and Philip and Henry would likely respond with swift and violent punishment for what they would call madness. Instead, Aldrich began taking extreme steps to protect himself. He secretly prepared his own meals using ingredients he personally selected and cookware he kept hidden in his study. He refused to drink anything Celeste touched, relying only on water from a well he alone could reach. Most importantly, he stopped sleeping beside her and locked himself into a guest room each night, fearing what she might do while he was unconscious. These actions eased his symptoms for a short time, but they also created new dangers. Visitors began to notice his thin appearance, his jumpy behavior, and his clear fear of eating or drinking near his wife. Soon, rumors spread through the parish that Jeremiah Aldrich was becoming unstable, perhaps broken by the stress of his strange marriage. Celeste played her part perfectly. When guests expressed worry, she answered with gentle concern, like a devoted wife caring for a sick husband. She prepared large meals he refused, offered drinks he rejected with visible fear, and behaved as though her kindness was being pushed away by a man losing his grip on reality. Her skill lay in making Aldrich's defenses look like delusions. His refusal to eat her food seemed like irrational terror instead of smart caution. His secrecy and distrust appeared to be signs of madness rather than proof that he was being slowly murdered. Worst of all, when he tried to explain the truth to Dr. Warren and others he trusted, they dismissed his words as the fantasies of a man ruined by financial loss and public shame. No one could accept that a woman who had once been enslaved could plan such a careful and extended act of murder. By late spring of 1854, Aldrich was trapped in a living nightmare. His clear understanding of the danger he faced had been twisted into evidence that he was mentally unwell. He was dying at the hands of the woman he was legally bound to live with, while every effort to protect himself only strengthened the belief that he was insane. Yet the torment was not finished. Philip and Ori had designed their revenge to destroy not just his body, but his social world as well. They wanted him cut off from everyone, abandoned, and fully aware that justice had finally reached him. The full truth was revealed in the cruelest way during a dinner party Celeste arranged to mark their 3-month wedding anniversary. She invited their remaining neighbors, Dr. Warren and several respected figures who still kept ties to the plantation. Aldrich spent the day preparing as usual, secretly eating beforehand and planning to avoid her food. When the guests arrived, Celeste announced a surprise, a bottle of wine said to have been aging in the cellar since before their marriage. She presented it as a symbol of their future. The bottle was opened in front of everyone, the glasses cleaned and poured under watchful eyes, leaving Aldrich no excuse to refuse. When Celeste raised her glass in a toast to many more years together, Aldrich knew that refusing would make him look completely unhinged. As he lifted the glass, he met her gaze. For a brief moment, her loving expression fell away, revealing cold triumph. By then it was too late. He drank, hoping the poison would act quickly. Within minutes, sharp pain tore through his stomach. His breathing became strained, his throat and chest burned, and he collapsed at the table. The guests believed they were witnessing the final collapse of a man long thought unstable. Dr. Warren rushed to help, but Celeste's dramatic grief blocked his efforts. She clung to her husband, crying and begging for help, while preventing effective treatment. Her performance was so convincing that others focused on comforting her instead of saving Aldrich. As he lay dying on the floor, Celeste leaned close and whispered the truth. Marcus Devo was my cousin. Jeremiah Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I have worked with Philip and Henry since 1845, waiting for the right moment to watch you die the way you made them die, slowly, painfully, and completely alone. The realization that his wife was not just a tool, but a willing part of the family revenge, settled over him as the last strength left his body. Punctuation added one last layer of horror to Aldrich's death. For months, he had been living with a woman whose hatred was close and deeply personal, not something paid for or forced. Every meal she prepared, every talk they shared, every moment that looked like peaceful home life was part of a careful act meant to increase his pain while keeping others from suspecting the real reason for his slow collapse. As his sight faded and his breathing grew heavier, Aldrich could still hear Celeste keeping up her performance for their visitors. She begged Dr. Warren to do more, prayed loudly for God to save her dear husband, and acted like a woman whose life was falling apart as she faced losing the man she loved. The other guests offered comfort and sympathy, fully convinced they were watching a sad accident instead of the final result of an 11-year plan for revenge. Died at 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854. Surrounded by neighbors who believed he had suffered a stroke or heart failure caused by long months of mental strain and failing health. Dr. Warren officially recorded the cause of death as natural causes linked to extended nervous exhaustion, a conclusion that satisfied everyone except Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle, who knew exactly what had ended his life and the reason behind it. The funeral drew a large crowd, with Celeste playing the part of the broken widow so convincingly that several well-known women from nearby plantations offered to help her run Willowbrook Plantation during her mourning. No one guessed that the crying woman standing by the grave was quietly celebrating the success of what would become one of the most complex murder plans in Louisiana's history. But Aldrich's death was not the end of the story. Philip and Henry had prepared for every possible outcome, including what would happen to his property and to his wife. As Aldrich's legal heir, Celeste inherited Willowbrook Plantation along with all its debts and responsibilities, debts that Philip and Henry quickly reminded her were now owed to them as agents of several financial institutions. Within a month of the burial, Celeste signed papers handing over ownership of the plantation to Philip and Henry in return for the debts being erased. Soon after, she vanished from Louisiana entirely, likely traveling north with enough money to begin a new life as a free woman in a place where no one knew her past as either an enslaved person or a killer. The official records of Jeremiah Aldrich's death and the transfer of Willowbrook Plantation raised no alarms among Louisiana authorities, who were busy dealing with far more urgent problems as the nation slowly moved toward civil war. The tale of a plantation owner who married his slave and then died of natural causes became a small footnote in local history, sometimes mentioned as an example of how financial pressure could drive otherwise respectable men to strange behavior. Yet among certain families in New Orleans and nearby parishes, another version of the story was quietly passed down through generations. This version spoke of a conspiracy so careful and patient that it took 11 years to complete, and of a justice so precise that the punishment matched the crime in both length and suffering. Above all, it served as a warning about the risks of betraying business partners, especially when those partners had relatives smart enough and cold enough to spend a decade planning perfect revenge. Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle achieved something extraordinary in the world of pre-Civil War Southern society. They carried out a murder case no court would have accepted, enforced a death sentence no judge would have ordered, and did it all in a way that left no trace of their involvement. Their success demanded patience, sharp thinking, money, and above all, a deep understanding of how Louisiana's social and legal systems truly worked. The changes at Willowbrook Plantation after Aldrich's death offered the final proof of how completely Philip and Henry had planned everything. Instead of selling the land for profit, they turned it into a safe haven for freed slaves and people escaping bondage, creating the very kind of humanitarian refuge that would have disgusted the man who built his wealth on human trafficking. The plantation house that once hosted Louisiana's elite became a stop on the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people reach freedom in the northern states and Canada. This change was not only symbolic but also largely unseen by local officials. Philip and Henry's respectable business reputations helped hide the unusual activity at Willowbrook, while their image as proper Louisiana businessmen kept suspicion away. They used their enemy's own property to fight the system that had made him rich, transforming his legacy into a weapon against everything he stood for. Perhaps the most striking part of their revenge was how completely Jeremiah Aldrich was erased from memory. Unlike victims of ordinary murders who are at least remembered as victims, Aldrich was carefully removed from history itself. His wealth was spread among the families he had harmed. His property was reshaped to serve causes that opposed his beliefs. His reputation was ruined by his own choices rather than by later exposure of his crimes. Most importantly, the way he died ensured that he would be remembered only as a failed plantation owner who made bad financial choices and an unwise marriage. There would be no monuments in his honor, no descendants to carry his name, and no true historical record of his actions, good or evil. He was wiped from Louisiana's past as completely as if he had never existed. This mystery reminds us that justice sometimes works outside the limits of the law, especially in societies where those laws are built to protect the powerful while ignoring the weak. What do you think about this story? Do you feel that everything was truly uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more horror tales like it, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves mysteries. I'll see you in the next video.